This is Becoming Antifragile with I.J. McConn. Each week I read a book and highlight the actionable wisdom within. To become anti-fragile, you must strengthen your mind and live with conviction. Let's get into it. Time to get rid of the filters. Make my life my favorite movie. Live my favorite character. Write my own script. Direct my own story. Be my biography. Make my own documentary on me. Non-fiction, live, not recorded. Time to catch that hero I've been chasing. See if the sun will melt the wax that holds my wings, or if the heat is just a mirage. Live my legacy now. Quit acting like me. Be me. So I gathered 35 years of my writing on the last 50 and took them to desolate places to seek their prudence, hear their story, and take inventory on my investment, me. I spent 2 weeks alone in the desert where I was conceived, 2 more on the river where I learned to swim, another 2 in a cabin nestled in the piney woods of East Texas, 3 more in a motel room on the Mexican border, and 2 more locked up in a New York City apartment. In each place, I looked myself in the eye, all 50 years of me. I was a scary proposition, alone with the one person responsible for all of it. The one person I can't get rid of. I wasn't sure I'd like what I saw. I knew it could get bloody, and it did. I laughed, I cried, I wrestled, I wowed. I also had the best time with the best company I've ever had in my life. So here I am, 50 years in, looking back to look forward. What's it all about? What's my thesis? What's my coda? What's my summation? What's my final remarks? What have I learned? What do I know? As an armchair anthropologist, folk philosopher, and truth-seeking street poet, I've followed celestial suggestions, made associations, heard many voices, and dealt with reality by literally chasing down my dreams. I've rented, had flings, hobbies, affairs, and chased butterflies to who knows where. All stops, no stays on my resume's road to where I am today. I have found possessions, laws, relationships, careers, a wife and family, and dropped non-negotiable anchors when I did. When I watered their gardens, they sprang to life, and learned lessons went from planning to performance, from knowing to doing, from acting to being. That's when the butterflies started coming to my garden. This is an excerpt from Greenlight by Matthew McConaughey. Matthew McConaughey is an Academy Award-winning actor. His films include Interstellar, Free State of Jones, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, The Gentleman, Mud, Dallas Buyers Club, and The Lincoln Lawyer. So Greenlight is a memoir. It's about catching the green lights in life and navigating the red and the yellow lights. And as you heard in the excerpt, Matthew McConaughey has kept a journal for 35 years. And this memoir is a distillation of the lessons that he's learned in his 50 years as a man, as a father, as an actor, as a husband, as a friend, as a brother, as a son. It's filled with stories. It's written in a very interesting way. It's not written like a normal book, which I think is why people enjoy this book and reading this book. It's also got these note to self post-its everywhere in the book. And what I found is that a lot of these post-its that he has inside of this book, they hold a ton of wisdom in it. And you're going to see them come up throughout this episode. So, a brief background on Matthew McConaughey. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the back of his book. Matthew McConaughey is the son of twice divorced, thrice married Jim and Kay McConaughey. Married and the father of 3 children, a self-proclaimed fortunate man. He considers himself a storyteller by occupation, writes poetry, and is a frustrated musician. He's an excellent companion on a road trip, believes it's okay to have a beer on the way to the temple, and is better with a day's sweat on him. A very intentional man, Matthew feels at home in the world, likes to compare before contrasting, and is constantly seeking the common denominator in life. I'll leave it at that. So, Matthew McConaughey always enjoyed his movies, whether they were blockbusters or not. And so reading Greenlight, I was interested in it because my wife had read Greenlights when it first came out, and she had told me to read it. This was about a year, maybe 2 years ago. And I finally decided to do it because I got my hands on a physical copy. And having read this book now a few times, I have a much deeper appreciation of Matthew McConaughey as a man, as a father, as a son, as an actor even. And when you look at his life and he goes through this whole thing, everything in his life from the outside looks so random. Like Matthew went from being the guy for rom-com movies to not doing any movies for a few years, and then came out to do The Lincoln Lawyer. Very different from How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. Then he goes on to do Interstellar. Then he goes on to do Mud, Dallas Buyers, The Gentleman. All these are movies that are very different from his rom-com days. And we're going to go through the journey for that. So diving straight into the book, one of the things that stood out to me, and it's something that we have briefly talked about in the episode with Sebastian Junger in Tribe, is this concept of the rite of passage. So Matthew McConaughey opens this book in the chapter of Outlaw Logic, and he's talking about how his father is sort of old school in this sense, and his father has 3 kids, and all 3 boys, they each have a sort of initiation that takes place. And the story that stood out to me most was the story of his brother Mike. So his brother Mike got a job as a salesman in the same place that his father was working. And Mike quickly became one of the best salesmen. And then he was given the account of their biggest buyer. You know, as a way to celebrate, Matthew McConaughey's father invites Mike to have a beer in the evening. And so they're having a beer. They're sitting down, and his father says to Mike, he says, "Let's go roll some pipe like we used to, son. It's been a while." So Matthew McConaughey explains, a rolling pipe is when you take an unloaded 18-wheeler to somebody else's pipe yard, load their pipe on it, drive away, and steal it. Dad and Mike used to do it on certain Saturday nights back when Dad was hauling. And so Mike, Matthew's brother, says, "Whose pipe you want to roll, Pop?" And his father says, "Don Knowles." So Don Knowles is the account that Mike was recently given. So Mike says, "No, I'm not going to do it. I just got this account and I'm not going to mess it up." So then his father says, "Who are you loyal to? To me, right? The man who got you the job, or to this Don Knowles guy?" But his son makes a stand, says, "Dad, I'm not going to do it." This is where things get very old school. So his dad says, "If you're going to challenge me. We're going to have to fight for it." So Mike and his father have a brawl. His dad throws a hook, throws Mike to the ground. Mike gets back up. They scramble. And Mike picks up a 2x4 and whacks it across Matthew McConaughey's dad's head. Boom. Dad is out. Out cold for minutes. And his brother is weeping and apologizing to his father, saying, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to do it. You made me do it." Kept crying. And then the father finally came to. And his father, he's bleeding, looks at him, gets up and says, "That's my boy, son. That's my boy." And Matthew McConaughey goes on to say, "From that day on, Mike was an equal to Dad, and Dad treated him as such. Dad never challenged Mike again, physically, morally, or philosophically. They were best of friends." And the reason this stood out to me is that we in our society, we don't actually have any form of initiation, any form of rites for boys to become men and for girls to become women. Historically, in most societies, there has always been this sense of initiation, the sense of rite. So within my own tradition, the boys, when they're young, they get sent to the log house. And the log house is where all the boys used to live together, where they're taught how to hunt, how to kill, how to cook their own food, how to survive in the wild. And that's where they become men. But in our modern day society, there is no sense of rites, of rituals, of initiation. And I think that actually has a negative impact because you prolong this boyhood. And now what I'm not advocating for is fighting your father for this. What I have thought about is there a way to do this, within my own life, within my own family? But it is definitely something that as a society, I think it would have a much larger impact on men and women, on boys and girls. Now, Matthew McConaughey, he says, "You see, rites of passage were a big deal to my dad, and if you were man enough to take him on, then you had to prove it, and Mike just did." Right, this is talking about Mike, his brother. So Matthew also has his own initiation at the age of like 17, 18. And that was when him and his dad were at a bar. They're about to leave. They've paid the tab, and a bouncer says, "Hey, have you paid your bill?" And his dad said, "Yeah, of course we've paid our bill." And they're about to walk out, and the bouncer tries to stop them again and places his hand on his father's chest. At that point, Matthew McConaughey, being loyal, seeing that as disrespectful to his father, throws a vicious right hook. Bang! Takes the bouncer down. They're fighting. Huge brawl happens. The bar is going wild. And a man pulls Matthew McConaughey off and says, "That's enough, that's enough, that's enough." And it was his father. And as Matthew McConaughey goes on to say, "That night was my rite of passage. Dad let me in. It was the night I became his boy, a man in his eyes. It was initiation into my father's regard." And throughout this book, what you see is this idea of initiation reoccurring in Matthew McConaughey's life over and over again. It allows him to evolve from, say, being the rom-com character, the actor, to becoming this guy who does serious roles, who does these complex characters. And he has to go through a form of initiation, which we'll get to in just a bit. But it happens when he feels like he's lost his way, where he feels like he's not being the man that he wants to be. He's doesn't feel like he's enjoying or loving the craft that he has, the craft that he's working on. There's a quote that I found that sums up this sense. It comes very early on page 62. And Matthew McConaughey says, "I lost the effort, the hustle, the mudding, the megaphone. I lost the fun." So what he's referring to here is this particular instance when he is in high school and he has a struck. And he used to be this cool guy that could pick up women. He was respected by his fellow classmates, the guys, and also the women. And so he would drive around this truck. He would have to put in the effort to compliment women, to pick them up. He put in the effort. But then what ended up happening was when he was driving past the dealership, he saw this car, this one particular car. And it was a sports car, the 300ZX, for sale. It was candy red. He wanted it. He thought, if I drive this car, I'm going to be even cooler. So then he trades his truck in for this car. And as a result of this, he starts taking care of the car more and slowly starts thinking that he no longer needed to put in the effort in this persona, in this character that he was developing in high school. And then he found that actually having this car made him less attractive because he had now lost his effort. He had now lost the hustle. He was no longer taking his girlfriends out mudding. He didn't have that big megaphone to compliment people with. He lost the fun. You'll see this reoccur again much later on in the book. Something very similar when he's living this hedonistic life and he needs a change. So one of the things that you notice in this book with Matthew McConaughey is that he's obviously, having kept a journal for 35 years, there's no way that you cannot be introspective. And he's very introspective and very reflective. And one of the insights that he has is this idea of where when you're trying to find yourself, when you're trying to understand who you are, trying to find your identity, he says, you need a process of elimination. So I quote, "The first step that leads to our identity in life is usually not, I know who I am, but rather, I know who I'm not." Process of elimination. Too many options can make a tyrant out of any of us. So we should get rid of the access in our lives that keeps us from being more of ourselves. When we decrease the options that don't feed us, we eventually almost accidentally have more options in front of us that do. Knowing who we are is hard. Eliminate who we're not first, and we'll find ourselves where we need to be. This is not a unique insight to Matthew McConaughey, and it's something that religions have practiced, right? There's this idea of via negativa. We also talked about it in the book with Nassim Taleb's Skin in the Game, the via negativa. And one particular thing that'll come up that is very applicable to this and shines very brightly is when he goes to the monastery and he spends time in solitude, and he does this a few times. But the reason the process of elimination works is that when you cull away the distractions, when you cull away the noise, eliminate the fluff in your life, all these unending choices in front of you, and you have narrowed it down to a few particular things, that is when you realize what it is that you are most drawn to. And that's when you realize, okay, I'm not these things. These things are all noise. These are all distractions that I was putting on myself, like putting on makeup to hide my flaws. But now that I've removed all these things, I truly know who I'm not, and it allows you to find that identity. And for Matthew McConaughey, very early on, he goes to Australia as an exchange student, and he gets paired with this family called the Dooleys. And these families are anything but normal, right? They're sort of a fanatic family, and they have these very particular rules around what they can say, what you can't say. You have curfews, you have all these things, right? And at one particular point, Mr. Dooley tells Matthew McConaughey, hey, you have to call me, Mr. Dooley, and my wife, Mrs. Dooley, mom and dad from now on. And Matthew McConaughey says, no, I'm not going to do that. I have a mom, I have a dad. I'm not going to call you mom and dad. Mr. Dooley insists on this, and he says, I'm not going to do it. Picks his plate up and says, good night, Norvell, which is the father. Good night, Marjorie, which is the mother. And this trip in Australia was the start of Matthew realizing who he was, because he, one, didn't have his family around, two, didn't have any friends, and three, he's in this completely strange place. Even though he's in Australia, he's not in Sydney, he's in this random town somewhere. And fourthly, he's with this family that's really pushing his buttons. And the whole time he's chalking up to cultural differences, and we'll find out later on that it's actually not cultural differences. So Matthew McConaughey, he's doing this. One of the other weird things that this Dooley tries to make Matthew McConaughey do is they try to convince Matthew McConaughey to kiss their son's girlfriend as a gesture of goodbye, and Matthew McConaughey refuses. The second time that Matthew puts his foot down, because he has conviction, he has certain values that he's not going to compromise. And Matthew McConaughey ends up leaving this family and joining other families. At the end of this trip, as he's spending time with the family, they're saying goodbye, and the Dooleys are not in this particular situation when they're having the send-off. One of the guys says, man, Matt, how did you survive with the Dooleys for so long? And he was like, what do you mean, how did I survive? And the guy says, the Dooleys are crazy. And that's when Matthew McConaughey realized this whole thing, his whole 6 months with the Dooleys was all a big, as he says, a big Australian prank. So he goes on to say, in fact, the time at the Dooleys was torturous, a living mental hell, a true red light at the same time. All my visions of grandeur were a mirage, but a handshake deal never gave me the option of returning home, so I endured. Only later did I come to realize that the suffering and loneliness I experienced would be one of the most important sacrifices of my life. So he had done this handshake deal with the Rotary Club in Texas, saying that he's going to stay in Australia for a year. The other interesting thing when he's in Australia is that he becomes a vegetarian, and he thinks he's going to become a monk. And so he basically only eats cabbages and greens while he's there. He loses a ton of weight. But again, he goes on to say, it was a year that shaped who I am today. A year when I found myself because I was forced to. A year that also planted the seed of a notion that continues to guide me. Life's hard. Later on, we'll see that he essentially tries to recreate something very similar to this by stripping off his whole identity and placing himself in a new environment to reinvent himself. There's a quote in here, in this chapter, when he's talking about style. It has a much broader applicability than style. So he says, you've got to know who you are before you know what you want to say, then not give a damn. But knowing who you are is the base that everything else comes from. And as we talked about, the process of elimination, you have to know who you are. You need to build that conviction to be able to take the risk for your beliefs. And if you can do that, then that is the start of knowing who you are. The issue is, with many people, is they are unwilling to take a stand for their belief. They're unwilling to look like a fool. They're unwilling to take the criticism that comes with making a stand. You have to, as Marcus Aurelius says, you have to be willing to walk among the insane to find who you are. And for Matthew McConaughey, he goes to law school because his whole family thinks he's going to be a great lawyer and, help the business, be the attorney for the business. But what he ends up finding is in his sophomore year, he's unable to sleep. He doesn't really enjoy what he's doing. So he says, I wasn't sleeping well, not because of my mattress, because of my mind. I was having doubts about my plans to become a lawyer. The math didn't add up. 4 years of undergrad, and then I'd be 23, then 3 more years of law school, and I'd be 26 before I get out, get a job. I wouldn't start making my mark in this world until I was almost 30 years old. So he's having this inner conflict But he's there because everybody has this expectation of Matthew McConaughey, the smart guy, straight A student, the lawyer for the family. So before final exam, he's sitting in his friend's room and he looks down and he sees this book, The Greatest Salesman in the World. And he starts reading this book. And it is at that moment he realizes, and I quote, "It occurred to me that it was a bad habit to lie to myself any longer. Becoming a lawyer wasn't for me. I wanted to tell stories." Unquote. So he decides to call his father. And he's nervous because now it's like a total shift, right? You're going from a lawyer to wanting to go to film school, which he thinks that's what he wants to do. So he calls his father. He's terrified. And when he tells his dad, the thing that his father responds with is essentially what gives Matthew the green light to become this Academy Award winning actor. So his dad says, if film school is what you want to do, don't half-ass it. And as I was reading this, I was chuckling to myself because it reminded me of the poem that I read at the end of the last episode with Kahlil Gibran. And I read a newer translation of this poem called Half-Life, or Don't Be Half-Lovers. And I'm going to read you the older translation of this poem, which I think fits much better for this particular situation. And so the poem is Don't Be Half-Lovers by Kahlil Gibran. Do not entertain half-friends. Do not indulge in the works of the half-talented. Do not live half a life and do not die half a death. If you choose silence, then be silent. If you speak, do so until you are finished. Do not silence yourself to say something, and do not speak to be silent. If you accept, then express it bluntly. Do not mask it. If you refuse, then be clear about it. For an ambiguous refusal is but a weak acceptance. Do not accept half a solution. Do not believe half truths. Do not dream half a dream. Do not fantasize about half hopes. Half a drink will not quench your thirst. Half a meal will not satiate your hunger. Half the way will get you nowhere. Half an idea will bear you no results. Your other half is not the one you love. It is you in another time, yet in the same space. It is you when you are not. Half a life is a life you didn't live. A word you have not said. A smile you have postponed. A love you have not had. A friendship you did not know. To reach and not arrive. Work and not work. Attend only to be absent. What makes you a stranger to them, closest to you, and they strangers to you. The half is a mere moment of inability, but you are able, for you are not half a being. You are a whole that exists to live a life, not half a life. I love this poem. And this is the poem that came to my mind as I'm reading this. And this is another repeating theme in Matthew McConaughey's. Life is, if he's doing something and if he's working on a particular thing, or he is off in the desert, he's never going to half-ass it. He's never going to be a half-lover. He's never going to be a half a craftsman. He's going to go fully in. Right? Again, very similar to Arnold Schwarzenegger's point of when Sean then Sean. If you're going to do it, do it. Don't be half committed to it. Be fully committed to it. And this is a lesson for us in that whatever that we do, whether that's in our love, in our marriages, in our friendships, in our work, in our craft, in our hobbies, if you are doing it, at least do it to the fullest capacity that you have. Don't allow yourself to be stuck in a what if later, a year down the line, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. Don't be the man or the woman that says, I wish I had done this more. I wish I had given it more of my attention. Give it all your attention right now, in this moment. Because whatever you do, you might not see yourself improving in the day-to-day, in the small scale of every single day, right? But in the grand scheme of things, you're going to see this improvement over time. It's going to compound. So, and Matthew McConaughey, he has this line in here when he says, any success takes one in a row. Do one thing well, then another. Once, then once more. Over and over until the end. Then it's one in an arrow again. His point is about success. He's saying you just have to continually put in your time, be consistent, and only then will you be able to see the progress that you've made. And if you're a half lover, for example, right, a half lover today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, by the end of it, as Gibran says, you're going to have lived half a life, and the lover that you love is not going to be your lover because you've only loved them half. But if you love your lover fully, because you are not a half a being, you are a whole being, your lover is going to be your lover at the end of it all. And it will allow you to live a life, a full life, not half a life. So he gets his blessing from his father. He goes into acting. He gets his first role. And soon after, his father passes away. And so Matthew McConaughey says, losing my father, like it is for many, was my most seminal rite of passage into manhood. Time to say goodbye to the boy I had been. Again, this idea of rite of passage coming through. And suffering is most definitely one of those things that will act as a rite of passage for many people. It was for me. And that's why when you study rites, right, when you study initiations in different religions and different movements, what you find is that there's a sense of not suffering, but there's a sense of like darkness and shadow involved, right? So for example, within Christianity, the idea of baptism, you're dying to your old self. In the water, you're being immersed, you're being held down there where the old self is dying. And so when you rise up, it's a new man, it's a new woman, and you're coming up out of your shadow. And so for Matthew, this losing his father was this darkness, this dark passage that he had to walk through. And on the other end of it, he retained this wisdom that his father had given him, and he takes it throughout his whole life. And one of the things that came very clear and sharp to him after his father dies was this idea that maybe he's been focusing on all the wrong things in this world of acting. So he says, the sooner we become less impressed with our life, our accomplishments, our career, our relationships, the prospect in front of us, the sooner we become less impressed and more involved with these things, the sooner we get better at them. Right? Because if you're keeping up with the Joneses, if you are trying to impress other people, if you're dependent on the external praises of others, you're not going to be focused on improving yourself, improving your character, improving your decisions. You're not going to chase and seek after wisdom because you're too busy impressing other people and being impressed with other people. And Matthew McConaughey goes on to say, all the mortal things that I had been revering in my life, everything I was looking up to in awe, suddenly came down to eye level in front of me. All the mortal things that I looked down upon, patronized in my life, suddenly rose up to eye level. It was time for me to get real courage. It was time for me to become a man. So what he does is he starts to take the risk, right? He starts taking a chance on himself, taking a chance on wanting to be the leading role. And that pays off. He gets a leading role in one of his early movies. What you learn from this is that you have to take risk, right? You have to make the decisions and then act upon it. And that's exactly what Matthew McConaughey does. So he ends up moving to Hollywood, California. He stays with a producer. Matthew McConaughey's trying to find work. And he says, hey, look, can you set me up with somebody, some sort of producer to get a role? And this producer says, and I quote, you shut the effing talk up right now. This town smells needy. You're done before you even get started. You hear me? You need to be cool. You need to get the F out of here. Get out of town, go to Europe, anywhere, and don't come back until you're ready to not need it. Then we'll talk about an agency meeting. You hear me? This is like a slap in Matthew McConaughey's face, but he realizes this is exactly what I need. He wants to be a man, but he seems desperate, right? He's looking too desperate at this point. So he takes a trip to Europe, travels around, comes back, and when he comes back, he's again found himself. It's a sort of initiation that he does. He's not thinking about taking meetings. He's not thinking about the next role he's going to do. All he's thinking about is the next day, right? The next mile he's going to travel with these guys. So when he comes back, he's much calmer. He's not desperate. And as a result, the Hollywood producer was exactly right. He was able to land more meetings, get the roles, and he starts to do extremely well. So he's got the movie Angels in the Outfield and Boys on the Side. It's going well. So what had happened was, he says, my very first audition in Hollywood had gotten me a second audition that landed me the fourth lead in a major motion picture drama starring Drew Barrymore, Mary Louise Parker, and Whoopi Goldberg. And as a result of this, he gets a big paycheck. He takes his paycheck, buys a house, or rents out a house, I should say, and it comes with a maid. He's living at the top of the world at this point. He's bragging to his friend one day, And he's saying, look, I got this house. And there's a maid that comes with it. She presses my shirt. She washes my clothes. And his friend simply looks at him and says, that's great, Matthew, if you want your jeans pressed. At that moment, Matthew McConaughey realizes that he's actually never asked himself what it is that he wants in his life. Right? What is it that he wants now that he's had the success that he's having? And he goes on to say, I had never thought to ask myself if I wanted my jeans pressed before, because for the first time in my life, I could have them pressed. And the answer, when he asked himself this question, is no, I actually didn't want my jeans pressed. And the lesson that we can take away from this is you have to ask yourself what you want before you get it, because sometimes you will get something that you think you want, and by the time you get it, you don't want it, right? You realize this is exactly what you don't want because you hadn't really thought through this properly. And there's a poem in there that he calls Why We All Need a Walkout, and I'm going to read it. Noise to signal ratio. We are more constantly bombarded by unnatural stimuli than ever before. We need to put ourselves in places of decreased sensory input so we can hear the background signal of our psychological processes. As the noise decreases, the signal becomes clearer. We can hear ourselves again, and we reunite. Time alone simplifies the heart. Memory catches up, opinions form, we meet truth again, and it teaches us. Landing on stable feet between our reaching out and retreat, letting us know we are not lonely in our state, just alone. Because our unconscious mind now has room to reveal itself. We see it again. It dreams, perceives, and thinks in pictures which we can now observe. In this solitude, we then begin to think in pictures and actualize what we see. Our soul becomes anonymous again. And we realize we are stuck with the one person we can never be rid of, ourselves. The Socratic dialogue can be ugly, painful, lonesome, hard, guilt-ridden, a nightmare, vicious enough to need a mouth guard not to gnaw our fangs into nubs while we sweat cold in feverish panic. We are forced to confront ourselves, and this is good. We more than deserve this suffrage. We've earned it. An honest man's pillow is his peace of mind, and no matter who's in our bed each night, we sleep with ourselves. We either forgive or get sick and tired of it. Herein lies the evolution. With nowhere to run and forced to deal with ourselves, our ugly everyday suppressions break out of the zoo and monkey around, where we find ourselves in the ring with them, deciding no more or let it slide. Whatever the verdict, we grow, and it's us and us, our always and only company. We tend to ourselves and get in good graces once again. Then we return to civilization, able to better tend to our tendencies. Why? Because we took a walkabout. What you can see here is somebody who's understood the importance of solitude, somebody who's understood that to truly understand yourself, your shadows and your light, you have to find that peace, the silence, and it's only in that silence that all the noise around you, the distraction, they quieten down. And yourself, he comes out, right? As he says, with nowhere to run and forced to deal with ourselves, our ugly everyday suppressions break out of the zoo and monkey around. And this is what we've talked about before, and it is the idea of overcoming the lower man. It's the idea of entering the labyrinth, slaying the minotaur, and coming back out. And you can only do this in silence, and you can only do this in solitude, because it's in solitude that there's nobody else talking to you. It's only yourself. So many are afraid of themselves. So many are afraid of silence that they distract themselves with music, with unending noise behind you, in front of you, in front of your eyes. But McConaughey realizes this. He wants to know what it is that he truly wants. He doesn't want, for example, that his jeans be pressed. So what McConaughey ends up doing is he travels to the monastery of Christ in the desert in New Mexico, because he says, lost in the excess of my newfound fame and struggling with non-deserving complex, and my now ruthless existence not only had me searching for my bearings, it was bearing down on me. So he's talking to this guy, brother Christian, saying, I've tried to be a good man, to not lie, and deceive myself. To be pure of heart and mind, but I'm full of lust, objectifying other people and myself. I don't feel a connection to my past, nor see the path to my future. I am lost. I don't understand myself. And the thing that ends up comforting him while he's talking to Brother Christian is Brother Christian responds by saying, "Oh, me too." So after his trip to the monastery, McConaughey travels back. His movies are a hit. And again, in all the noise and in all this distraction that he's having, he realizes again he needs to go somewhere else. He needs to go to a place, somewhere where people don't recognize him, and he's getting tired of this. So he says, I needed to go someplace where any affection I collected would be solely based on the man those strangers met and got to know after I arrived, not before. I needed to hear myself think. So he has this moment. And one of the things that he ends up doing, he ends up flying to Lima, Peru. And when he's in Lima, Peru, he's camping out and he can't sleep at night. Right? He's having difficulty. And he writes, in my tent, grappling with my demons, I couldn't sleep, so I quit trying. Instead, I stripped off my clothes along with every badge, banner, expectation, and affiliation I had on me. I removed every idol that ever gave me comfort and security and pride or confidence. Who was I? Not only on this trip, but in life. Now, naked, stripped down to nothing, I was only a child of God and nothing more. Soaked in cold sweat, I vomited until there was no bile left in my belly, then passed out from exhaustion. So when he wakes up, he feels different. He feels like something has changed in him. He has no burden. His spirit feels it's much lighter. And he writes, no longer in a rush to get anywhere or anticipating what was around the corner, coming up next or up ahead. Time slowed down. I raised my chin to the sky and said a quiet thank you, then glanced down the path. For the first time, I saw the Amazon River. And a side note here, before he travels, before he has this experience, he actually has a dream of him floating down the Amazon. He's in Africa, but he's floating down the river, the Amazonian River. And so he wakes up and he tries looking for the Amazon River in Africa. Obviously, the Amazon River is not in Africa. And he realizes that. So then he finds it and ends up traveling to Peru. So from that morning on, after he's had a restless sleep and he's ended up battling his demon, stripping away everything that he thought made him Matthew McConaughey, right? And realizing that what makes him Matthew McConaughey is not any of these accolades that he has, right? It's not the affiliations, the banners, the praises that he gets, but it's the man that's sleeping in bed, naked. So he says, from that morning on, I was present, embracing only what I could see in front of me, giving it the justice it deserved. He was living in a state of flow. When you are present in that moment, as Csikszentmihalyi writes about in the episode we did with him, and when you are present in that moment, whatever it is that you do, what you'll find is that that moment gives you more of itself because you've given it more of yourself. So McConaughey says, I had crossed the truth. Did I find it? I don't know. I think it found me. Why? Because I put myself in a place to be found. I put myself in a place to receive it. And that last sentence, I put myself in a place to receive it, I think is just a very subtle but powerful line, in that you must prepare your mind, your body, to be able to attain to truths about reality. There's a difference between knowing and understanding. And this is something that I've had to wrestle with over quite a few years. When I was in grad school and I was doing philosophy, I was obsessed with knowing. And there was a sense of pride and arrogance that came with this idea. But what I didn't have was I didn't have understanding. And it was only after the difficult things that I had to go through that I realized there's a big difference between knowing and understanding. There's a big difference between loving God and knowing God. And you may not believe in God as I do, but this is why I always emphasize that to love God is more excellent than to know God. There's no point in being a believer in God if I mistreat my neighbor, I mistreat my wife, I mistreat my daughter. It's much better to love your wife more deeply and to love your daughter as much as possible than to claim that you know God and to be missing love. That's why, for me, and as I was reading this section in Matthew McConaughey, that's what stood out to me. It stood out to me that here's a man who's now coming to this realization. There's a big difference between knowing something and understanding something, to know truth and to have conviction about the truth. One character in his book that I like a lot is Matthew McConaughey's mom. Matthew McConaughey's mom has this attitude of, if it resonates with you, if it changes you, whatever idea it is yours. So early on in the book, Matthew McConaughey is doing a poetry competition. And in the poetry competition, he writes a bunch of poems, and his mom says, yeah, these are not great. Go back, do it again. So then when Matthew comes back to his mom writes down a poem. And the poem is, if all that I would want to do would be to sit and talk to you, would you listen? This is a poem by Anne Ashford. But Matthew McConaughey's mom writes this down and says, do you like it? And she says, yeah. So then his mom says, well, then write this as your entry for the poetry contest. And he says, but Mom, this is not mine. He says, well, she says, if you like it and you understand it, then it's yours. The idea that his mom is trying to push on him is, when you make something yours, when your being understands that thing, the idea becomes part of you. The majority of the things that we believe in, are not really our own beliefs. They were handed down to us. They were given to us by our parents, by our teachers. And that's why it's important to self-reflect, to explore ideas, to read these books that we're doing and studying them, to see, okay, what are the things that resonate with us? What are the things that we can learn from Matthew McConaughey's 50 years as a man, as a father, as an actor? So going back to his mom, one of the other things I liked about his mother is, his mother has this belief to fully embrace who you are. So at one point, he wants to audition for Time to Kill, Matthew McConaughey. And so he's calling his mom saying, I'm going for this audition. And his mom's advice to him is, don't walk in there like you want the role, Matthew. Walk in there like you own it. And that's exactly what Matthew McConaughey does. He goes in there. So he gets the role. And after he gets the role, he writes, I ran off into the night until I was about a mile away from anyone. Then with tears in my eyes, I dropped to my knees, faced the full moon, extended my right hand up to it and said, thank you. And the side note I put here is, believe in yourself. Don't limit yourself. Have conviction in your belief and take action. That's a lesson that his mom was pushing on him very early on. Now Matthew McConaughey is an Academy Award winner, won a ton of other awards. He has this paragraph that stood out to me. He says, don't create imaginary constraints. A leading role, a blue ribbon, a winning score, a great idea, the love of your life, euphoric bliss. Who are we to think we don't deserve these fortunes when they are in our grasp? Who are we to think we haven't earned them? If we stay in process within ourselves, in the joy of doing, we will never choke at the finish line. Why? Because we aren't thinking of the finish line. We're not looking at the clock. We're not watching ourselves on the Jumbotron performing. We are performing in real time, where the approach is the destination and there is no goal line because we are finished. And the note I made here is, these are the words you will hear from a person dedicated to their craft, dedicated to the process of learning, dedicated and committed to the work, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. And this is what makes you great at what you do. When you are committed to the process, when you're playing in decades, when you're playing this for your whole life, that is when the biggest difference happens. That is when you fall in love with this process. And we talked about this specifically with Csikszentmihalyi's episode, right? Because Csikszentmihalyi's idea here is you want to find flow states in your life. The more flow states you can enter, the more meaning you will find in your life. And so for me, one of the things that I had taken a break from it and started again was painting. So if you go to my Instagram, there's a painting that I had done a few months ago. And I had picked up painting very recently after 15 years of having not painted. And it was something that I did basically every day from very, very early on. And I had stopped painting when I went to university, when I went to grad school, and when I was working. Then when I took my sabbatical, that's when I realized painting is one of those things that has always given me the most profound experience doing. There are other things in my life like that, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, doing this podcast, and where I get fully enveloped in the process that I actually lose track of time. And so right now, I'm now doing my second painting. And the second painting, I'll tell you what it is about. I'm painting a battle between what I see as the Minotaur and yourself. So the higher man fighting the lower man, and they're in a wrestling grip with each other, head to head. I'll have that done within the next few months. And with McConaughey, not every single one of his movies was a blockbuster, right? There were lots of failures that happened, and he writes, the box office failures didn't dampen my love of acting. If anything, they made me more feverishly committed to my craft. I loved performing. I loved creating. I loved getting lost in a character then found. I loved going so deep as to see my man from the inside out. I loved the work, the process, the construction, the architecture of building and owning my man. I loved having a wife who never interrupted my belief that each role I played was the only and last role I'd ever play. I loved acting more than ever. So at this point in his life, Matthew McConaughey is completely in love with acting. And this is near the end of the book that he writes this. That he's gone through all this and he realizes this is what I love. That is something for us to consider. If you don't already have a craft that you're dedicated to, I think finding a hobby that you can dedicate your whole life to perfecting, to becoming, and that will make you a better man in the process. Watching a movie is not a craft. Being a movie critic, maybe that's a craft. But watching a movie, passively consuming, as Csikszentmihalyi says, passive leisurely activities, they are not things that are good for you. Now, let's move back in time a bit. And we're moving back to a time when Matthew McConaughey, again, is very successful. He has all these things. He's gone to the monastery. He's had these sort of profound epiphanies. But again, he's very famous. Everybody knows him. He's making lots of money. And at one point, he says, with all this new money he's making, he had a running tab of $120,000 at the chateau because he just had an open door there. And so he'd come in, he's obviously renting this space out and he's preparing for roles. Okay, he's living this life that, from most people's perspective, is a very successful life. He's living this hedonistic life, which he admits by saying, maybe it was the 18-month hedonism tour that I'd been on at the chateau, the booze, the women, the gluttony. But what happens is that he gets the offer to play Van Zandt in The Reign of Fire, which is a movie about dragons. So he snatches his right up because he sees in Van Zandt, the character, a man who's living the opposite life that Matthew McConaughey is living. Van Zandt is not a hedonist. He's far from a hedonist. As McConaughey puts it, Van Zandt is a man with a singular constitution, not doing what he could do to survive, rather doing everything he could do to deny extinction. An island of a man whose freedom was his isolation. And it's interesting because it's precisely around this point that Matthew McConaughey starts to wonder about the meaning of it all, the meaning of life, and starts questioning the existence of God. So he says, I'd been questioning my own existence and searching for meaning in my life for as long as I could remember. But now, for the first time, I was also questioning the existence of God. What you'll realize here, if you've listened to the Leo Tolstoy episode from episode 2, is that very similar to Tolstoy. Tolstoy is about 50 when he has this, basically a very similar realization. And he had been living what he calls an Epicurean life. Right? A life of hedonism, a life of plenty of women, alcohol, gluttony. But Tolstoy realizes there's no meaning at all, right? He's missing this one thing that makes all of this meaningful. Even though he has all of this, it's all just straws. It's all just useless to him. And Tolstoy, he goes on a very long journey to find the meaning in his life. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I recommend checking it out. But that is the note that I made here. It's reminds me of Leo Tolstoy. At this point, Matthew McConaughey, he's gone through this process. He takes the role of Van Zandt and it starts this process. He shaves his head, tries to live like Van Zandt would live. And it starts this process of him trying to understand where he is, the man that he wants to become, right? He starts to think about this. And he's still considered the rom-com man, the guy who's in all these like chick flicks. And so he says, as much as I was enjoying the self-engineered ease of my life, I was becoming uneasy with a couple of things. One, the romantic comedies stopped presenting a challenge for me. I felt that I could read the script today and play the part tomorrow. Two, I was beginning to feel like an entertainer, not an actor. Still, I felt like I was posturing instead of behaving, playing a part instead of being more of myself, and acting was feeling like a means to an end that I had no address for And if this was all acting was for me, then I wasn't sure I wanted to act. Here you're again hearing the voice of a man who's dedicated to his craft, who's realizing that in his pursuit of attaining this craft and making it his whole life, he's carved a path towards it where it's become too easy for him, where he's not learning, where he's not growing as a man, where the characters are not challenging him. So when you have a craft, so for example, when you're painting, with each painting that you do, you learn something new about yourself and something new about painting. Same with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or same with any sort of martial art. Each time you go onto the mats and you're training, you will learn, you will lose, you will win some. And in those moments are how you grow and how you become better as a craftsman. So McConaughey has this realization and he wants to stop becoming a rom-com guy. What ends up happening is very interesting. He falls in love with his woman, Camila. They become pregnant, he becomes father. And being a father is one of the only things that he's wanted in his whole life. It's one of these things that starts to bring clarity in his mind. He starts to realize that his attention is being spread too thin between family, the foundation that he has, acting. He has a production company and a music label. And he felt like he was making a lot of B's because his attention being spread, his energy is being spread too thin. So what he ends up doing is he ends up shutting down the production company and the music label, eliminating 2 of the 5 commitments. So now he has 3 things. And the reason he does that is that he wants to do really well. He wants to make A's, as he says, in the other 3, which is family, foundation, and acting. He has more time, more energy to focus on these things. And the lesson that we can take from here is we too have to do the same thing. We too have to take hold of our attention, to focus on the task at hand, and also be able to see what it is that we want to build, what it is that we want to do. Because you can be fully focused on this present moment that you ignore the larger vision that you have for your life. So it takes 2 things to do this. 1 is reflection and 2 is conviction. Reflection you require because it allows you to reach the conclusion of what it is that you want to do. And conviction you require to act upon that conclusion. And for me, there were things in my life that I thought, these things are taking too much of my attention. For me, what it boiled down to, right, where I felt like I was being spread too thin. During my sabbatical, during my silent retreat, I realized that the things that I want to focus on is creating this podcast, is making the best possible episodes I can make, and also painting, becoming better at this. So it's my podcast, painting, jiu-jitsu, and my family. Right? And there are obviously other things in between, but I wanted these to be the things that I focus on. So the question for you is, what are things for you, as McConaughey says, that are making you be spread too thin? And what are some things that you have to call, some distractions that you have to call so that you can focus and make A's in your life? There's a note in here, his note to self, that I have a double tick on. So usually when I'm reading books, and if I double tick, it means I wholeheartedly agree. And so I quote, "Man is never more masculine than after the birth of his first child. Not macho, masculine. After his firstborn, a new father's head, heart, and gut are more aligned than they have ever been. His 5 senses on the same frequency. His intuition is in the tune. He should engrave an instinct he has for the next 6 months, personal, financial, spiritual, or career. He should trust that he knows and know that he can tell the future, because now, for the first time in his life, he is living for it, and it is living for him. Bet it all and sweep the board." And I agree with this wholeheartedly, because that is the experience that I've had in the birth of my son all those years ago, and now my daughter, that when it happened, you are able to see things much clearer. That's why friends will ask me who don't have children yet, what is it like being a father? And I often tell them it's one of the best things, because when you become a father, you're able to see things in a new light, in a new perspective, because now there's this little human being dependent on you. There's a little human being, most importantly, looking up to you as a figure, as somebody that they would like to emulate. And so you have the great responsibility of rearing and teaching a future generation. And McConaughey goes on to say later on, "Just as the early death of my father made me level up and become a man, the family emergency along with Fatherhood, helped me more deeply reconsider my life and who I was, especially with my career. Death, family crisis, and newborns, the end of a life, trying to keep a life and welcoming a new one. These are 3 things that will shake your floor, give you clarity, remind you of your mortality, and hence give you courage to live harder, stronger, and truer. So for him, as I mentioned earlier, it is this rom-com thing, right? He no longer wants to be this character. So in the fall of 2008, he decides to stop doing rom-com completely and tells his agent, don't send me any more of this. Anybody who's interested in me, tell them I'm out. And so the poem that he has for this is called Selfish. When I'm rich enough to not care about money, when a child's life is more important than my own, when my self-worth isn't reliant on the adulation of others, when I don't care anymore to outscore my desires, I look near and within and get selfish. This is the measure of a man's greatness, when a man becomes classic, when mortal rewards are no longer enough to pay his rent, man becomes legend. Fish for yourself, selfish. What you see here is Matthew McConaughey realizing that the external praises of others, that the rewards you get from other people, they are not worth anything at all. To live for the praises of others, to become dependent on them for your confidence, means that you have lost your way. And as Epictetus says in his quote, if it should ever happen to you to be turned to externals in order to please some person, you must know that you have lost your purpose in life. And this is precisely what Matthew McConaughey realizes. His purpose in life was the adulation of all these people, the praises of others, the rewards that he was getting. Now that he had his kids, he realized, no, those are not the things that are important to me. The things that are important to me is my family, is living in this moment, is perfecting my craft. And Epictetus is one of the episodes that we did early on, so check that out. So with McConaughey, he's taking a big risk here because everybody knows him as the rom-com guy. Personality on screen as this romantic, attractive guy, shirtless, all these things. The risk that he's taking by rejecting these roles and turning them down, it gets more and more tempting as the space between his last movie and his next movie increases. And so there's one offer that comes to him to play a role, and he says, no, I'm not going to do it. And they say, oh, we'll give you $5 million. And he says, no. So then they come back and say $8 million. He says, no. Come back and say $10 million. He says, no. They come back and say $12.5 million for this role. And he says, no. Then they come back and say, we'll give you $14.5 million to do this role. He says, he rereads this script and he's like, wow, this character is now, it's more enticing than when I read it and the offer was $5 million. With $14 million in front of him, he's tempted. But McConaughey has the conviction, right? Because he's reflected on it. He knows what he wants, so he turns it down. He says, I'm not going to do it. And so for more than a year, he doesn't get a single role. And in that year, he lives his life on his own term. He spends time with his family. He spends time with his friend. He does the hobbies that he wants. He's perfecting his other crafts. That was precisely what he needed, because it was through this, his lack of presence in the media, that allowed him to create a new image. The McConaughey of the rom-com era was fading out. And it was at this point, as he says, the anonymity and the unfamiliarity had bred creativity. Casting Matthew McConaughey as the defense lawyer in The Lincoln Lawyer was now a fresh thought. For the rest of Hollywood, he had disappeared. Everybody had forgotten about him. For Matthew McConaughey to come back, play this new character that he's never played, this very serious character, it was not off-brand. It seemed something that he could do without any sort of questioning. So one of the things that McConaughey says, define success for yourself. What is success for you? He writes, we all want to succeed. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what is success to us? More money? Okay. A healthy family, a happy marriage, helping others, to be famous, spiritually sound, to express ourselves, to create art, to leave the world a better place than we found it. And he goes on to say, we are all made for every moment we encounter, whether the moment makes us or we make the moment, whether we are helpless in it or on top of it. The predator or the prey, we are made for that moment. The reason he says you have to define success for yourself is that when you've defined success for yourself and you're living and you're walking on that path towards it, every moment that you encounter, you make that moment yours. But if somebody else defines success for you, then you're walking down a path that's not yours. That is pre-scripted, that when you're walking on it, when the trials and the tribulation comes, you will be easily tempted to go off it. Just like McConaughey was tempted with $14.5 million to play this role. But because he had conviction, because he knew what success was going to be and it was not going to be playing rom-com, it became easy for him to say no, to turn it down. And for this week, the challenge is for you to really think about what success means to you. And related to that is, what kind of man or woman do you want to be when you get there? And for McConaughey, as we saw, there were moments where he had to go and redefine himself, whether that was going to the monastery in New Mexico, whether it was going to Peru. There was another time that he went to, which I didn't mention, is he went to Africa. And when he was in Africa, he ended up wrestling this wrestling champion of these multiple villages. And in his match, it was a draw, but in his match, what he learned was that he was unafraid. He had the courage to say yes to the fight, even though the guy was much bigger than him. As a result of that, he earned the respect of the villages that were there, and also he earned respect for himself. But it's because one of the things that he defined himself with was that he wanted to be a man of courage. And so with that, I'm going to wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. I appreciate you. If you have not subscribed, do subscribe. Leave me a review on Spotify. You can click those 3 dots on Spotify and it'll say rate this episode. And then on Apple Podcasts, write a review if you've learned something. And you are more than welcome to email me at ij@becomingantifragile.com if you have any questions or if you have book suggestions. Till next week, peace.